Gordon House, downtown Kingston, during the ceremonial opening of Parliament. The JLP councillors are contending that the abrupt end to last Thursday's meeting has affected the ability to properly constitute subsequent committee meetings. The St. Anne police have taken a woman into custody for the murder of her child's father during a domestic dispute in the parish last night. The deceased has been identified as 37-year-old Swain Rivas, a call center agent of Queen's Drive in Montego Bay, St. James. More on these and other stories in the news segment of Beyond the Headlines at 5 o'clock.
News on Radio Jamaica. Stay in the know. Radio Jamaica, active for the good of our nation.
The inspirational hour between 4 and 5 p.m. is brought to you by Jamaica Plumbing Supplies. Shop online and visit Jamaica.
That they could remember what they were doing in administrative contexts. And they started with mnemonic devices, which are just kind of drawings of things that you have in agriculture, barley or an animal, and numbers. And that eventually evolves into a fully fledged writing system. And I go through this in my book using emojis because I think they're actually an excellent analog for how they expanded a very narrow system of signs to reflect things like happy or a grammatical ending like an S to mark a plural is quite a remarkable evolution, and it's so interesting that we have every stage of that preserved in the archaeological.
So in some cases it'll be a pictogram, but you combine pictograms with symbols that represent a letter sound or a syllable and so on, and they mix together.
Eventually, that's exactly right. Eventually, they mix together, and that makes it possible for this new writing system to reflect more than one language. Because once you can reflect sounds with the signs, with the characters, then you can write pretty much anything. I mean, I can write a sentence in English if I wanted, using cuneiform.
What would you give to have 350 BCE is sort of roughly the time of the main monument at Stonehenge, I think, isn't it? Yeah. What would you give to have written records from what we call prehistoric Britain?
This is the great frustration when you look at these ancient worlds. How can you have a point of contact with them? How can you break down the chasm of time that separates us? And I have to say that Moody's book does it so beautifully, partly because it's so personal. Beautiful descriptions of what it's like to be pregnant, to give birth, to have small children, to love a dog. And I love the way in which you're not just writing about priests or kings, but you are giving us a clay tablet on which a little child has bitten. So you have the imprint of his teeth.
And this is a piece of homework, isn't it, I think?
Yes, or dog, the prints of dogs on clay tablets, and you wonder, were the scribes amused by this? Is this why they kept them? And to look at these kind of very intimidating, impersonal statues and friezes of kings, and then to think we have dog prints and small children biting on clay tablets, it does kind of melt away the sense of time, I think.
Well, it becomes used, doesn't it, for letters and personal communications. Mm-hmm. Having started with this very transactional use of language, beer receipts.
Basically.
A lot of beer receipts. Enormous numbers of beer receipts.
Yes.
And preserved for us in part because they're writing on clay. So if the library burns down, everything within it is better preserved and not destroyed.
Exactly. It bakes everything and preserves it so that it's actually great news when a library burns down in Mesopotamia.
When does it start to be used for what we would think of as history, as a kind of a considered record of the past?
I would say in the 3rd millennium BCE, and I'm being deliberately, it's a huge time period, it's the whole 2000s, really, BCE, you start to see records of things that have happened. So, for example, around 2500 BCE, there is a record of a border conflict between two cities, Umma and Lagash, and it's sort of like 100 years' wars. It's a multi-generational conflict, and they're writing, both during the conflict and then after, memorializing everything that happened. Is it exactly accurate? No, it's written with ideology in mind, and their mythical figures make their way into the storyline as well. But there does seem to be an effort to record and memorialize something probably quite violent and traumatizing for the two cities that happened.
And in many cases, that record is, in essence, a title deed, isn't it? It's saying we own this because our predecessors owned this, and their predecessors owned this.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the kind of justification for access to or ownership of something, and again, there's a little element of history there, has to date back to, there has to be some sort of credibility to it, and age often lends that credibility to them.
You have a very interesting story about the priests of Sippar.
Yes.
Just tell us that, because that's another use of history entirely, isn't it?
Yes, I was so glad to get to include this in the book, but it's one of my favorite objects. So back to around the time of Enigaldinana's palace and the museum that we started with, a group of priests in the city of Sippar, who were part of the temple to the sun god Shamash, may have felt that their jobs were under threat. The new king, Nabonidus, was more into the moon god, and they might have worried that they had to find a way to lend credibility to their posts as well as their continued salaries. So they created this 3D cross-shaped stone monument. I say monument, it's not very big, it's about a foot tall. And they covered it in like a fake font that was meant to look old. And parts of it may be a copy of something real that was, copied about 2,000 years earlier. But the rest of it is mostly some anachronisms and misspellings and things like that that give it away as a document that's firmly from that era.
Ye oldie.
Exactly, burning the edges of the paper.
But also, I loved what also gave it away was they kept insisting, this is not a lie, it is indeed the truth. So you immediately know it's a lie.
Exactly, I love that line. And they even chipped away at it. There is evidence of sort of almost a saw being taken to parts of it to make it look damaged.
So you tea stain an old document if you want it to look ancient.
Exactly, yeah. And then they dug it up and said, look, we've been here for thousands of years, you can't cancel us, okay?
But that palace, the palace in which, the label or the potential museum label was found, was the palace of Enigaldinana, I think. Mm-hmm. Her father was also using history in that way, wasn't it? Reconstructing a kind of sense of the past and giving her a job because he said that was what was required by history.
Exactly, yes. One of the challenges of that whole dynasty was that they kind of came out of nowhere, and especially Nabonidus. And in ancient Mesopotamia, that doesn't really work. You have to model yourself on some past dynasty, or you have to be bloodline connected to them. And so one of the ways they did that was basically through archaeology. They would find all these old temples or things that needed rebuilding, and they would say, I'm going to rebuild it as it was in the past, and they would find old objects and display them. And I think so there was this concerted effort to connect with a distant past. And the job of Enigaldinana itself, she was appointed as the high priestess to the moon god in Ur, which is a very, very, very ancient post that dates back to the old Akkadian kings in the 2300s BCE. And in fact, the first known post holder that we think is the first known post holder of that, Enheduanna, is also the first named author in history. And so he's making a concerted effort to connect his dynasty, especially through his daughter, with that distant past.
The bloodlines and pedigree are absolutely crucial in the lives of the Caesars too, Tom Holland. One thing, your prologue points out that as far as we know, only a single copy of this book survived from Roman. It wasn't written on clay, but
there may have been more. We know that there was a copy in Constantinople in the 10th century because it gives us the dedication, which doesn't survive in the edition that we have. But we know that there was one in Germany in the age of Charlemagne, because it inspires a courtier at Charlemagne's court to write a biography of Charlemagne modelled on the biography of Augustus.
But potentially, the book might not have survived.
Absolutely.
What would our sense of the Roman world be like without it? Is it even conceivable?
I think it would be incredibly impoverished, because I think that what the lives of the Caesars give us, and it covers essentially 2 centuries, from about 100 BC up to the end of the 1st century AD. And these are 2 centuries when Rome is going from being a republic to becoming an autocracy, and when it's going from being a Mediterranean power to spreading its power much further beyond that. And what it gives us is portraits of the men who are the most powerful figures in this world as they rule. And when I say portraits, I mean they are unbelievably vivid portraits. We know what Augustus's teeth look like. We know
yellow and
with kind of little
large
gaps between it. We know that Tiberius had a mullet, and when I say mullet, I mean the kind of the Australian hairstyle rather than the fish, which does also intrude on his life story in a rather unpleasant way. But these kind of details, which you simply don't have for, say, the great kings of Mesopotamia. You know, we have these formal statues of them, but we don't know whether they had bad breath. We don't know what their sexual habits were. We don't know anything like that. We don't know what their favourite food was.
No, curiously, we know more about ordinary people in Mesopotamia because they're writing letters to each other and kind of, carping about the neighbour and all of that sort of thing. Who was Suetonius? Is it an accident of history that he coincides with this period, or does he...
So he becomes essentially the kind of political secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, and he's been part of a literary set that includes Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, the great historian. And Suetonius himself is an archivist, I guess, of a kind of figure who would have been very familiar in the Mesopotamian courts. But of course, the problem is that Mesopotamian clay tablets survive, but Roman libraries, with the single exception of the Library at Herculaneum, has not survived. And so therefore, the brilliant thing from our point of view is that Suetonius has access to archives and letters and all kinds of things and has transcribed them into his biographies. So to that extent, they have survived. He goes on to become Hadrian's secretary. Hadrian is a well-travelled emperor. Probably the one thing in Britain people know about Hadrian is he comes to Britain and builds a wall. And Suetonius comes with him and is embroiled very appropriately in a sex scandal that doesn't see him kind of executed or any. It's not that level of sex scandal, but it's a sex scandal sufficient to see him forcibly retired. And I guess he goes back to his villa and composes his lives.
It's interesting that his connection with the archives, he notes when in his life of Augustus, he notes that Augustus wrote the exact time of day on every letter he wrote. He wrote the time of day at which he wrote it. Now, presumably, Suetonius must have seen that for himself.
He must have done, yes, because he's very proud of having access to these letters and quoting them. And it's incredible to have the personal correspondence of Augustus Caesar. We have great formal pronouncements that he's, describing his deeds and his accomplishments. We have the statues, we have the coins, the images of him. But to have personal letters where he's writing to his wife about family members, worrying about them, I mean, it's incredible.
What were those Roman archives kept for? Why did they value and preserve those records of the past?
Well, they would have been family records to begin with. They are not kings. The pretense is that it is still a republic. And so Augustus rules as first citizen. And then when he dies, the question is, well, how does this system perpetuate itself? And it perpetuates itself essentially as a kind of a family monarchy. So they would have been preserved for that reason, in the way that families, Roman families are obsessed with preserving details of their families, as Gus was saying about, this is what people want to do. And then when the family of Augustus goes extinct, basically because they've all murdered one another, then the question is, well, what follows? And then you start to get a kind of more institutionalized form of autocracy. But these are, relatively speaking, parvenu emperors. They have taken on the name of Caesar, they've adopted it, it's not theirs by right. And so who are they to eliminate the archives of Augustus? I mean, you wouldn't do that. And so it's a very, very literary society. It's a society with quite a strong sense of history, a strong sense of the value of archives, and that's why they keep them, I think.
And is there anything you might call Roman historiography? A discussion of the nature of history?
Yes. I mean, Roman historians themselves are very interested in this question, and there are kind of more broader philosophical discussions about it, absolutely.
You point out that Suetonius was not, nor had any wish to be a historian. So what did he think of himself? What did he think he was doing?
I think he is, he's closer to what we might call a social anthropologist, because we have lists of other works that he wrote that have not survived. So that would include books on clothing, on childhood, on public entertainments. There's a collection of the lives of the greatest courtesans, which I wish had survived. But it suggests that he's interested in kind of everyday activities, food, childhood, sex, all these kind of things. And he brings those perspectives to his lives of the Caesars. So he's interested in the childhood. He's interested of Augustus. He's interested in what Tiberius might eat. He's certainly very interested in the sex life of Nero, which is kind of staggering.
He's interested in the sex lives of everybody he writes about if he gets the information.
But I don't think that's simple prurience. I mean, there's an element of prurience. The Romans are very, very into gossip and scandal. They do love that. But I think that Suetonius describes the sex lives of the Caesars as well because he feels that it's important. It provides an insight into the moral character of these emperors and therefore the character of their rule.
Was he, by contemporary standards, a good biographer? Did he, as it were, check his sources, make sure that what he was writing was true, or did he think, well, I'll put all the stories down and readers can decide for themselves?
I think it's variable. The life of Augustus is the longest and the most impressive and definitely shows evidence of quite close archival work. Suetonius is very pleased that he has found a small statuette of Augustus with this rather obscure name that he is insisting Augustus used and his critics don't. And he says, well, look, I found this statue. It has the name on it. And what is more, I have given it to Hadrian and he keeps it in his private quarters.
It's a bit of a name drop,
yes,
that, isn't it?
There are others where, frankly, he gets overwhelmed by the material and sadly for the reputation of Tiberius, the emperor who succeeds Augustus, who is an incredibly impressive man. I mean, a brilliant general, saves Rome twice from disaster, tremendous intellectual, very, very effective emperor. And Suetonius is drawing on an adulatory life of Tiberius, and we get all these details, but he is also drawing on a life of Tiberius written by someone who clearly detested him and comes out with the most revolting accusations against Tiberius. Do you know that some of them are so revolting that I can't even begin to hint at them?
Yeah, no, I think I know the ones you're talking about.
Yes,
I mean,
but there's a kind of Jeffrey Epstein quality. He's retired to an island, Capri, and the things that he's getting up to are disgusting. And I think that the likelihood is that most of these are not true. It's the Roman assumption that if you retire and you want a private life, your only reason for doing that is because you're a massive pervert. This is the assumption, I think. And so the fact that Tiberius, who by this point is quite elderly, has effectively retired to Capri, enables his enemies essentially to manufacture abuse about him. So Tiberius is the theme of these two biographies, one very positive, one very negative. What Suetonius has done is basically just merge them together, and his attempt to try and explain the contradictions, they're hopeless.
Yeah. Is he looking for balance, or is he trying to assert a particular kind of perspective?
I think he's overwhelmed by the contradictions. So he's saying Tiberius is a very sober, serious man who has devoted himself to the service of his country. Oh, and at the same time he's an absolute pervert who's hanging around in swimming pools with small boys.
Oh, dear.
How do you explain these contradictions? I mean, I think the obvious explanation is you can't, because they're coming from completely different perspectives. But the consequence of this is that it's a terrible biography, but as a creation of myth making, it's astonishing.
Towards the end, Tiberius's perversions and cruelties are succeeded by greater perversions and cruelties and greater perversions of Caligula and Nero. Do you think Suetonius had a sense that he was writing in any way as a cautionary tale? That in between the lines here, he was trying to sort of say, this goes wrong if you do it this way.
Yes. So in his biography of Caligula, he has my favourite line from any biography ever written, which is effectively, enough of the man, now to the monster. And he gives a tremendous list of all the appalling things that Caligula has got up to. But I think that with the family of Augustus, which is Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, these are portrayed as almost figures from mythology. because they are part of the family of a man who is now a god. Augustus has been elevated up to the heavens, and there's a sense in which these emperors, because of that, can lay claim to a kind of semi-divine status, the status of the kind of hero in a Greek tragedy who might kill his mother, or who might sleep with his sister, these kind of things. And so that is what Suetonius is doing. He's giving it, the fascination of the biographies is that they are simultaneously incredibly intimate, all these personal details that you get, and yet unbelievably alien and terrifying.
Who was he writing for? Did he have a notion of readership?
I think as I said, he's part of a literary set, so I imagine that he is writing for people who are interested in the recent past, and the question of how Rome went from being a republic to becoming an autocracy is very, very, it's the great theme, say, for Tacitus, who is a much greater historian, although slightly less interested in the racier details that Suetonius is into. But this is clearly the great question which oppresses many of the kind of elite Romans who would have been kind of literary. How did our freedom become a form of slavery?
So there is the notion of kind of an instruction here. Gus Casely-Hayford, I want to turn to you. You're the inaugural director of V&A East, which is just about to open its first outlet, V&A Storehouse, and it's opening in May this year. It's a very different way of doing a museum, isn't it, by the sound of it?
It is, and and in a way, it's a collection, a storehouse.
But it is literally a storehouse. It's where you keep a lot of...
It's a working store, but it is also a different kind of store in the sense that we want it to be not just a place for academics and museum specialists. We want this to be a place that is living, in which anyone can feel that they can come and they can engage with the collection. And what a collection it is. This is more than 250,000 objects and 1,000 archives, and they tell 5,000 years of the story of human creativity through some of the finest things that have ever been made, and they're there for you.
The big difference is that you've got a scheme called Order and Object. Tell us how that works.
Well, in the past, if you wanted to access museum quality objects, traditionally in somewhere like the V&A, that you would apply, you'd probably write a letter, you would then go to our reserve store, and you would probably then have to kind of wait, and it would be enormously complicated. But what we have created is a scheme where anyone, you don't have to have a qualification. You ideally might make an appointment, but that isn't absolutely necessary. You can come in and you can engage with the collection, that there are spaces and there are experts who will give you hands-on time with our 250,000 objects, and some of these things are so exquisite, and we are so excited to be able to give everyone time with these objects, and also to give access to our teams of experts who can really help to really embed you in the sorts of histories that these objects are drawn from.
I have to say, the first time I read this, I thought, my first question was, how on earth did you overcome the curatorial instinct to protect exquisite objects from the public? Because it's a hazard, isn't it?
It is, but anyone who works in museums, of course they want to conserve and they want to protect objects, but they simultaneously, that they are lovers of history and material culture, and they want people to see and to engage with things. And with, listening to Tom and Moody, that so much of the history that they're talking about are the histories of people. And if we want to transcend that gap between us and the past, or us and vast kind of swathes of geography, actually getting into places where we can handle things, up close to them, actually to tangibly engage with things, that is the way in which a lot of young people, I think, will feel that history can come to life. And we want to give young people those opportunities. And I've taken objects out into schools, many tens of thousands of young people engaging with things that would otherwise have been in cases without any damage whatsoever.
Have you found a particular kind of object working a particular magic? I mean, is it just antiquity? I mean, Moody, you write about the extraordinary charge when you hold a clay tablet that's been held by somebody else thousands of years before
It's incredible.
in their hand, and you know the kind of hand movements that have gone into it. And I'm wondering whether there's similar things that when you go to schools that people really kind of latch onto.
There are things which are enormously valuable or enormously old, but then there are also things that have been created at great cost. That there is a dog tag that was created by a prisoner who's serving 225 years in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, at least 45 years of that confinement, and he has created these absolutely exquisite stainless steel dog tags that are beautiful to behold, and you show them to young people and you talk about the limits of choice that someone had, but they chose to create something of that level of beauty, and it talks to young people in terms of their choices of freedom, of creativity, and how you can transcend the limitations of your circumstance through engagement with the creative processes. And so, of course, there are risks in opening up our collections for this in this way. But think about all of those young people and the ways in which these collections can speak to the national curriculum, they can speak to professional development opportunities, but also just speak to inspiration and hope. I think it's a glorious opportunity.
You've got collections as well, which sort of cross over the border between the intangible and the tangible. The David Bowie collection you've got, which obviously is an enormous archive of things.
Yes.
But it's surrounded by this penumbra of the music. How are you going to deal with that and get a sense of the music into the object?
Well, you will hear the music, you will see the performance, but the critical thing I think about museums and collection stores is that you will get up close to the tangible thing, and that is the difference between screens and social media and facsimiles, is that this is about engaging with the great man himself through connection with things that he actually touched, that he actually created, that he actually loved. You can be absolutely kind of that close that you can feel the presence of that great man, and you can do that across a whole collection. And so some of these things are 5,000 years old, and you can get that sense of closeness, of tactility, of creative processes. You can actually see those things and engage with them. And I think for young people, where screens are kind of one of the great ways in which they mediate a lot of the world, to be up close to that sort of tangible way of dealing with history and geography is so exciting.
You're not immune to the tangible, are you, Tom Holland? You collect Roman coins, dinosaur bones.
Literally a dinosaur. Yes, I bought a dinosaur in an auction. So I mean, I'm so excited at the thought of this, because I think the V&A is perfectly suited to it. Because it's basically an enormous conglomeration of stuff, and
Great stuff.
and it caters to every interest, I'd have thought. So there would be presumably things from Mesopotamia for Moody. There's Roman frescoes for me, but you've also got David Bowie's guitar. I mean, it's perfectly suited, I would guess, to the kind of collections that the V&A have.
The V&A was established to inspire, and to inspire both artisans and craftspeople and artists. That's part of the mission, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Henry Cole, he's this radical figure. The idea of museums, of course, being places of reflection and inspiration, but he wants an absolute revolution in terms of giving people who traditionally weren't engaged in museums opportunities to change their professional development opportunities. This is a space in which you would hopefully transform people into kind of engines of creative invention. That this would be a space within which we would be catalyzed and galvanized into thinking about our creativity, but also in creating opportunities opportunities for others. And it is a glorious idea that translates into the 21st century. And I hope in East London that we can continue to do the glorious things that were established in the 1850s in West London.
You've got that storehouse. You've also got a very beautiful new building, V&A East, a separate museum building. References a Balenciaga dress, I think. It sort of looks as though it's got a twist in it as it rises. What will happen inside there?
So, our museum, which is, as you say, an exquisite building, and it will house our permanent collection, and we are looking at our collection through the lens of making, that we want, because we are on a campus with a number of universities that focus on creativity and design, and we want this to be a place within which you can come and get up close to objects, but also see them through the frame of making. We think making is such an encompassing way of thinking about our collection. We all engage with it before we can walk or talk. Making is something that we all are inspired by. And so that is a way in which we kind of lens our collections. But also, on the floor above, our first exhibition will be focused on Black British music, which we are so excited by because we have been researching this opening exhibition for 3 years, and just about every single major Black British musician has donated their instruments, their notes, their costumes. It is going to be such a glorious exhibition, and we hope it will bring a whole new audience into museums of their own volition. This isn't about museums by gunpoint. This is museums that we hope young people will absolutely kind of flock to.
You're obviously tapping into the power of celebrity there, which is has its own very, very long history. There's a bit of that in the Caesars, isn't there? And in Mesopotamia too, Moody al-Rashid.
Bit. I mean, I think some figures were definitely larger than life, and I think,
Is there any equivalent to the V&A's preservation of objects which are beautiful and preserved because of their beauty? Do you ever get the sense of that in Mesopotamian finds?
Definitely. I mean, for a great example is a series of statues of a leader called Gudea that were found from 2200 BCE that were found in the sort of mid-first millennium layer that somebody obviously dug up and preserved and put in their courtyard because they were just beautiful. And I think, just...
and is it our supposition that they kept them because they were beautiful and not because, as it were, they provided a pedigree for the current palace?
Possibly, but they would have been in a completely different language, and they were put in a palace, and they had temple plans on them. So there were a couple of disconnects there that make it hard to. I mean, it's impossible to say, but it's there are definitely examples.
But I think what you clearly see, looking at Mesopotamia or Rome or V&A now, is this universal human instinct to collect and to gather things, but also clearly the motivation for that varies from time to time. So I guess that if it was a museum, then it's done essentially for religious reasons, for reasons that would not correspond to what the V&A is doing, and yet the impulse at core is the same.
Well, and also strange things happen to whatever you collect if enough time elapses.
Yes.
I mean, you have a lot of beer receipts.
Yes.
So, do you ever think you've got too many?
No, impossible. Impossible to have too many receipts for beer. But I think what's beautiful is that each of these objects, however mundane, a receipt for beer, a statue of a king, they each tell a story, and they're a kind of an intersection of stories, including the story of the person today that may interact with it, whose life it may change. And I think the stories we tell become the world we live in. So I think what you're doing is just incredible.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. This programme is now history. Thank you to all of my guests. Gus Casely-Hayford, the inaugural director of V&A East. Their first site, the Storehouse, opens at the end of May. Tom Holland's translation of The Lives of the Caesars by Suetonius is out now. And Moody al-Rashid's Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History is available later this week. Next week, Adam Rutherford explores the spectre of obsolescence in Britain's industrial heartlands. For now, goodbye.
Star of the Week was presented by Tom Sutcliffe. It was produced by Katie Hickman, and the assistant producer was Natalia Fernandez. In a few moments, Evan Davis speaks to the entrepreneur and inventor Rob Law on how he avoided a manufacturing meltdown. But first, with a look ahead to the world tonight at 10, James Kamarasamy.
Thanks, Al. The Prime Minister has said there needs to be a US backstop for a Ukraine peace deal. He was speaking after an emergency meeting of European leaders in Paris. And on the eve of US-Russia talks on Ukraine, we'll hear how the Paris meeting went, get American and Russian perspectives on the coming negotiations, and we'll hear what the British public thinks about the prospect of British troops serving in Ukraine. Also tonight, will the government fall short of its house-building target because of a shortage of construction workers? We'll get the latest on the Pope's health, plus a Palestinian hip-hop artist on the future of the Palestinian people, and could re-wolfing help to mitigate the effects of climate change?
James, thank you. James Kamarasamy back in just under a quarter of an hour with The World Tonight. And on Radio 4, The Decisions That Made Me, in which business leaders talk about the turning points in their careers. Here's Evan Davis.
It is surely, as a business leader, one of your worst nightmares. Not your own organisation's collapse, that obviously ranks as number one. No, this nightmare is the collapse of another business, but one that could bring yours down too. And it can happen in a flash. For example, March 2023, Donald Baird was on a transatlantic flight from Paris to New York, not long after hearing that his company, which was a climate tech startup, was about to become collateral damage in the imminent collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, which was then the go-to lender for US tech firms. Desperate not to lose the cash his business had tied up there, and with the plane yet to take off, he convinced the stewards to turn the aircraft's patchy Wi-Fi on, and then he sat in a toilet cubicle for more than half an hour, desperately trying to move his funds elsewhere, before he feared they would disappear. As it turns out, US regulators did step in a few days later. They took over Silicon Valley Bank and guaranteed clients access to their money, but Donald didn't know that. Often, and especially when things go badly wrong, time is a luxury. So what do you do when another business upon which you rely, perhaps for your survival, gets into serious trouble? Do you cut and run, hoping to find an equal partner elsewhere, or do you go all in and try to save them? I'm Evan Davis, and this is The Decisions That Made Me. It is a new mini-series from the team behind The Bottom Line, in which we focus on the key moments and tough choices faced by various UK business leaders. We will hear how these big calls have helped shape their companies, their careers, and their characters. Now, in this episode, my guest, who faced one of these stick or twist decisions, is Rob Law. He's the inventor and founder of Trunky, the ride-on suitcase for children. Now, you can hear more from him in an episode of The Bottom Line about having good business ideas. That one is called Ideas, How to Turn Dreams into Business Reality. And for more episodes like that and more stories like this one, do stay subscribed to The Bottom Line podcast. And if you want to know when we publish an episode, hit the notifications button on BBC Sounds and change your settings in the app. That way you'll get a message every time we publish new content. Now, when I spoke to Rob Law, and I had a much croakier voice than usual, we started with how we got into product design in the first place.
Yeah, I guess I struggled a bit at school. I had undiagnosed dyslexia. I was always using my hands, being creative, but really struggled to find a good outlet at school. And I actually have cystic fibrosis, so growing up, I realised I couldn't dream about being a spaceman or a soldier because of my condition. So I guess, thinking back, I probably had to think a little bit more logically about what it is I was going to be able to do. And as I was pretty awful at school and I couldn't escape to the army, it was like, what can I do? And really found a love for design. And I remember picking up a book in a bookshop in London about product design, and had these amazing visuals of marker renderings of the futuristic products, and I thought, wow, that's amazing, that's what I want to do. So I bought some markers, self-taught myself how to do those beautiful pictures, and really got into it, and bought every book I could around the subject, which was quite a niche subject at the time. And ended up being lucky enough to go to the best university in the country at the time, up in Northumbria, Newcastle, which is where Jonathan Ives of Apple fame had studied a few years earlier. And walking into that university, seeing all these amazing pictures on the walls of the future. I mean, this was before LCD screens were much of a thing, so all the students were designing with these liquid crystal displays and what you could do with them, and it was just like, wow, that's amazing, that's what I want to do.
But I'm interested, did you identify yourself mentally as someone with a disability? Or
No, the way I got through it was just pretending I was normal. And although I had to have a different diet to most people in the early days and had to do lots of physiotherapy behind closed doors, there was a big stigma around this disease, but externally I just wanted to be perceived as normal.
Yeah, and did you feel that out of that adversity came strength?
Well, I think I was reasonably motivated, but I had a big turning point when I was 15 and lost my twin sister who also had CF to the disease, which was hugely tragic, but an incredible life lesson to be almost gifted at the time, and that's like life's short, you've got to make the most of it. So I kind of made a promise to my mother without saying it out loud that I wasn't going to put her through the same situation and she'd see me grow up. So yeah, I just forged ahead with living every moment, and actually at university it was incredible. My mates used to call me the Duracell Bunny. I just would want to go to every party and do everything that was available to just make the most of life. Yeah.
Now, you're one of those people who has a life-changing and brilliant idea while at university. Yeah. Frankie, the idea that ultimately has made you famous, you actually had that idea at university while studying design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was a national luggage design competition to invent a piece of luggage, and the idea came looking at ride-on toys and thinking maybe make a ride-on toy that features a piece of luggage. But it actually took 9 years to get that product to market effectively, and then just really took off post an infamous episode on Dragon's Den.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother decision. When we do talk about that in the Bottom Line podcast, which I referred to, but you didn't get the money.
No, the pitch went perfectly. I towed Richard Farley around the studio on it, and then the pink trunky Trixie ended up at Theo Pathetis' feet, and he decided to do a bit of strength testing, popped off the toe strap, and all the dragons were lambasting me with words like, I could invent a better product, or your business is worthless. But after the programme aired, I mean, everyone was talking about the episode around water fountains around the UK. It really helped build the brand.
I think I hadn't realised about you and the trunky was how much you were thinking about what it was made of, how it was made, and ultimately where it was made. Just talk us through that, and then we'll get to this decision, this really quite big decision.
So, where are we? 2006, when I launched the business, the product was made out in China, because it was very cost effective to do so, and we shipped it over to the UK to be sold, and we were exporting from China to a couple of different international markets. And then I think it was 2009, the US dollar massively appreciated against sterling, and when you're buying from China, you're buying in dollars or renminbi, and we had to really adjust our pricing to the retailers because they really hit our margin. We're shipping a fairly large, bulky product that is reasonably lowish value, so the shipping costs were about 20% of our costs. You were ordering on like 120-day lead time, so you need to know what stock you need, and because we had so much success to start with, no one could forecast for that demand, so we're always playing catch up and we're always out of stock of various SKUs, so I was very frustrated by that. And when things really kind of settled, and this is sort of 2010, 2011, and we really felt on top of the demand, I started a project to look at reshoring production and finding a manufacturer in Europe that might be able to do it cost effectively.
I mean, that's a decision lots of businesses have actually been taking, isn't it? It was everything out to China in the 2000s. Not quite as beneficial as it was, because of course Chinese production costs go up as they become more affluent, the wages rise, and it becomes more expensive. So you bring it back, you find somewhere in the UK that can make it. Great.
And then I get this phone call at the end of the year, having had a very successful year with Trunky, where the MD told me that they were just on the brink of going into liquidation.
Wow. So now you've really got a decision to make. What are you going to do? What were the choices?
So I'd invested about £500,000 in this project. We had this really expensive tooling that was ultra efficient. All the packaging, all our marketing was around UK production, so it felt really hard to then go back. And also we'd have a huge gap in availability, so we'd be out of stock for like 4 months. So it just made total sense to me to buy the factory out of administration and become vertically integrated. It was kind of like almost like a gut decision. Like, that makes so much sense.
This is a massive decision, though, because this is really, you're now going into manufacturing.
Yeah.
And you're a designer with a great product. Manufacturing is a totally different business.
Yeah, the idea was we'd carry on with the third-party customers and we'd still be manufacturing for other people, but I felt at the time, because there was a lot of reshoring being talked about, and I thought there'd be a lot more businesses wanting to reshore, and we could help them and produce for them. Also, if we were manufacturing it, then it made sense to build a warehouse right next to the factory and just really reduce those road miles that the Trunky was shipping. So instead of it coming all the way from China on diesel-fueled ships, we would be making it in Plymouth, moving it 10 metres next door to the warehouse, storing it and shipping it direct to the customer through our e-commerce site or Amazon or whatever, and direct to the retailers.
What did people say when you said, I think I'm going to buy a factory?
No one thought it was a good idea. I had so much pushback, which really took me by surprise, because to me it just made perfect sense. But no one supported the idea. Back then it was still me as the majority shareholder. I had a small angel investor, but I was also considering doing a big equity fundraise with private equity. So we put that project on hold and went through the process of acquiring the factory.
What worries me about this decision is you're making this decision to buy a factory that has shown it's not fit for purpose, because it's just had to go into liquidation. So it's not just I'm buying a factory, it's I'm buying a failed factory, and I now have to be better at doing what it was doing in order to make that a good decision.
Yeah, so part of the short due diligence we did was rechecking those numbers, and it still stuck up to that we could cost effectively make it in the UK, and we just had to figure out that production piece. So a great tip I got at the time was, like, Rob, don't go down there and try and sort it out yourself. Hire an expert, a consultant, to go down there and do it. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the problems we're dealing with, she had a 3-month contract and she stayed for 2 years.
Right. So you do buy the factory, you're the boss, and you have enough money to do that, presumably, at that point.
Well, actually, buying the factory out of administration was about sort of £40,000, but we went to the bank and borrowed £500,000 to turn it around, because we realised there was going to be some working capital requirements.
Investment. Right, so you've got the factory. Tell us about how it worked out.
Well, I kind of liken it to a load of headless chickens running around not knowing what they were doing, and it wasn't the people's fault, it was the leadership fault. So the MD hadn't really thought about running the factory and people. Like for Trunky, I went on a big journey around leadership, around having clear vision and values for the organisation that the whole team were aligned behind. But in the factory, no one cared. The night shift would produce scrap all night and not turn the machine off because they didn't like the MD and couldn't care. So it was just a bit of a chaos ship, really. But to me, it just made sense to really kind of align people around a common goal, a common vision. I sat down with the then leadership team, or the senior team, and just they got out of bed because they were just proud to be making in the UK. So we put proud to be manufacturing in the UK above the door. Then started a very long journey to try and find a really good production manager who understood mass production, which is where they were failing. And the first guy we hired ended up having a mental breakdown, and we had to find someone else. Eventually we found a really good guy to come in and steer the ship. By then we had a lot more understanding and processes down. Everyone had job descriptions, people knew what they should be doing, and we started turning this ship in the right direction.
So ultimately, it was the right decision.
Well, throughout Brexit, it was phenomenal because the exchange rate then flipped, so it was actually very cost effective to make it in the UK because sterling was so underappreciated. And then through COVID, when the demand dropped off a cliff because we were in a children's travel product business and no one was travelling, so we had a very rough COVID experience that lasted kind of 2 years. So we had to shut the warehouse down, we had to put people on furlough, we had to restructure the organisation and make lots of very difficult decisions. But when it bounced back, we had onshore production. We didn't have 120-day lead times to wait. We weren't having to pay those phenomenally expensive shipping costs. So at one point in COVID, it cost more to ship a Trunky than it did to actually buy it from China. So that really worked for us, and we were able to ride that bounce back really well. So those are two great experiences we had that we couldn't have survived without that factory.
My thanks to Rob Law, inventor and founder of Trunky. And thank you for listening. We will be back with another business leader to hear about the decisions that made them. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bottom Line podcast so you don't miss a single one. In the meantime, we'd love to hear about the decisions that made you and your career. Our email address is bottomline@bbc.co.uk.
The Decisions That Made Me is presented by Evan Davis. The producer is Drew Hindman. The World Tonight with James Kamarasamy is next, but first a look at that all-important weather forecast. Tonight, Northern Ireland will see outbreaks of rain. Scotland will be cloudy and dry to start, with just the odd snow shower, but longer spells of sleet, rain and snow will move in overnight. The remainder of the UK will see patchy cloud move in from the southwest, but southeast England will see clear skies through much of the night. Tomorrow, Scotland will see lingering wintry showers to start, but will turn drier during the afternoon. This is BBC Radio 4 on 92 to 95 FM, on BBC Sounds and on your smart speaker.
It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. Welcome to the World Tonight with James Kamarasamy. After an emergency meeting of European leaders in Paris, the Prime Minister outlines his conditions for sending British troops to Ukraine.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop.
We'll explore whether there's popular support for the idea here and get a view from Moscow.
It's a total non-starter. No NATO country, from the Russian standpoint, is acceptable as a peacekeeper in Ukraine.
Also tonight, will the government fall short of its house-building target because of a shortage of construction workers? And could this become a familiar sound in the Scottish Highlands? We'll discuss the prospect of reintroducing wolves to help meet climate commitments. That's all after the BBC News, read tonight by John Hammond.
Sir Keir Starmer has said any deal to end the war in Ukraine must include what he called a US backstop to deter Russia from attacking again. Speaking after a meeting with other European leaders in Paris, the Prime Minister repeated he was ready to deploy UK troops to Ukraine as peacekeepers, but he insisted that only an American guarantee could deter Russia. Sir Keir also said Europe would have to do more to provide security for the continent, describing it as a generational moment. Our correspondent in Paris, Andrew Harding, says very little is known about what the European leaders have agreed.
Having been on the receiving end of so much bile, frankly, and hostility from members of the American administration in the last few days, the Europeans look to be dialing things down, trying not to antagonize Trump needlessly, but also standing up for what they want to do. And clearly, the fact that they're keeping things under wraps means that Europe is still working out its position. And of course, it's still working out what is rhetoric from the Americans, what is serious, and where Europe can make the best use of its strength to make sure that it is at the negotiating table and influencing particularly the Americans.
Speaking ahead of the summit, Sir Keir Starmer urged fellow European leaders to step up to ensure a lasting, just and enduring peace in Ukraine. The Prime Minister said he wanted the UK to play a leading part in protecting what he called the front line of Europe, once again refused to commit to when defence spending would be increased. More from our political correspondent, Hannah Miller.
The Prime Minister said the UK was facing a generational challenge in relation to national security and should continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, whatever happens next. Sir Keir reiterated that US support would be critical to preventing President Putin from attacking again, but stressed that everybody in Europe needed to do more collectively on military capability, funding and training. While stating that the UK needed to spend more on defence, the Prime Minister said no decisions on that matter would be made until the current Strategic Defence Review was completed. A spokesperson didn't provide any details as to how many troops might be required from the UK to assist any future peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, or what the financial cost might be, saying that to do so would be to get ahead of discussions.
The US Secretary of State has met the Saudi Crown Prince in Riyadh.
Marco Rubio is trying to get support for Donald Trump's controversial plan to relocate the Palestinian population in Gaza so the US can take over the territory and rebuild it. Arab leaders plan to meet before the month's end to propose an alternative. The Vatican says the Pope is in a complex clinical situation as he continues to recover from bronchitis. It says the Pope, who's 88, has developed a polymicrobial infection of the respiratory tract, which has prompted doctors to change his course of treatment. From the Vatican, here's Bethany Bell.
The Pope, who's 88 years old, has been suffering from a respiratory infection for more than a week and was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on Friday. The Vatican said it wasn't clear how long he'd have to stay in hospital. It said that tests had showed what they called a complex clinical picture. He was in a stable condition, it said, and did not have a fever. The Vatican spokesman, Matteo Bruni, said Pope Francis was in good spirits and had been reading the newspapers. Pope Francis has had influenza and other health problems several times over the past couple of years. When he was a young man, he had pleurisy and had part of his lung removed. The Vatican said the Pope was touched by all the many messages of affection he'd received. It said he was particularly grateful for the good wishes which had come from people who were themselves in hospital.
The United Nations is appealing for almost £5 billion to provide urgent aid to millions of people affected by Sudan's civil war. Officials say the conflict, which is approaching its second anniversary, has caused the world's worst hunger crisis, with famine conditions reported in at least 5 areas. Nearly 2/3 of Sudan's population now need assistance. The UN Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher launched the appeal in Geneva.
This is a humanitarian crisis that is truly unprecedented in its scale and gravity, and it demands a response unprecedented in scale and intent. It's a crisis that is increasingly crossing Sudan's borders, threatening to destabilize neighbors in ways that risk being felt for generations to come.
A plane has crashed on landing and flipped upside down at Toronto International Airport. Footage has shown fire crews spraying the Delta Airlines craft with foam as it sits in heavy snow. The airport say all passengers and crew are accounted for, but paramedics are treating 8 people for injuries. A new study says wolves should be reintroduced in parts of Scotland to help the growth of native woodland. Researchers from the University of Leeds believe the animals would help resolve the problem of red deer eating tree saplings in the Cairngorms and the Highlands. That could allow an additional 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide to be absorbed each year. But some experts say society is not prepared for the reintroduction of wolves into the wild. Steve Micklewright is from the Scottish Rewilding Alliance.
We know that wolves would bring a lot of ecological benefit to Scotland. They would eat a lot of deer, and that would enable woodlands to regenerate, therefore helping with the carbon situation. However, we haven't lived with these animals for 400 years. A better option is perhaps to think about lynx, which would bring many of the benefits of wolves, but are less likely to take quite so many sheep, and there'll be less conflict.
Facebook's parent company Meta says it plans to build the world's longest undersea cable to bring industry-leading connectivity to 5 continents. The tech giant said Project Waterworth would connect the US, India, South Africa, Brazil and other regions with a 30,000-mile cable.
John, thanks very much. You're listening to The World Tonight with James Kamarasamy. Ukraine deserves peace through strength. Those were the words this evening of Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, deliberately echoing the language of Donald Trump after today's emergency meeting in Paris, where European leaders discussed their response to the Americans starting talks on Ukraine with Russia in Riyadh in the next few hours. She posted that on X together with a photo of the leaders who were in the Elysee Palace. Among those at the table, Sir Keir Starmer, who certainly didn't downplay the stakes when he spoke after the talks had ended.
This is a once-in-a-generation moment for the collective security of our continent. Only a lasting peace in Ukraine that safeguards its sovereignty will deter Putin from further aggression in the future.
The Prime Minister went on to say that the Trump administration's message that Europe needs to do more for European security shouldn't have come as a surprise, and he repeated his offer of potentially placing British boots on the ground in Ukraine under certain conditions.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
While Britain seems set on playing the role of a bridge to the United States, other European leaders aren't exactly rushing to cross it. And no noses have been put further out of joint by recent American words and unilateral actions than German ones. And the first leader to leave the Paris meeting was the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Ahead of a general election at the weekend he is widely expected to lose. He made no attempt to hide his irritation with the US-Russia talks.
It is completely premature and completely the wrong time to have this discussion now. I'm actually a little irritated by these debates. I want to say that quite openly. Discussions are taking place over the heads of Ukraine about various possible results of peace talks that haven't taken place and which Ukraine did not agree to and has not been at the table. I'll say it quite openly and honestly. That is highly inappropriate.
Well, let's speak to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who is in Paris. Hi, Katya. Let's start with that suggestion again from the Prime Minister of European troops on the ground in Ukraine. How did it go down, as far as we know, with other European leaders?
So there are definite mixed opinions. I think when it comes to Olaf Scholz, it's sorry, what you can hear is I'm on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, which you can hear all around me, even though the leaders' meeting has broken up. But yeah, the idea of boots on the ground, as it's often referred to, made a lot of noise at that meeting, and leaders definitely didn't speak with one voice. It's understood that the UK and France led the way there, but Spain and Poland were more reticent. We've heard just now from Germany. I would urge caution with Olaf Scholz's remarks, though. As you say, he is approaching a general election in Germany. He's also speaking to the electorate at home, whereas the CDU, which is the party, the Christian Democrat Party, which is expected to take the largest number of seats, today suggested that it would be open to sending troops to oversee an eventual ceasefire in Ukraine. But yes, there's definitely disagreement because there's not much known about what kind of troops, how many troops, under whose command, what would be the mission statement. So with so much open and no ceasefire in sight as yet in Ukraine, definitely the leaders weren't focusing on that. But they did also talk about, or come to a conclusion on that, but they were also talking about spending more on defence, for example, and there they did agree, of course.
Katya, many thanks. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, there live from the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Well, that meeting was taking place just before the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is due to sit down with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Riyadh for talks that will broach the subject of ending the war in Ukraine. Dan Reiter is a professor of political sciences at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the author of an influential book on peace negotiations called How Wars End. So what does he expect the US approach to these talks to be?
I think the strategy is to use the variety of levers it has to get a deal rapidly done. I think that the objective is to get a deal and a little bit less concerned with some priorities like making sure that Ukraine has long-term security.
So speed rather than attention to detail?
That would be my guess. I think that President Trump values the accomplishment of an end to the war and is a little bit less concerned if elements of the outcome are not quite satisfactory to all parties. Ukraine may be asked to accept limits on its military, as part of the deal. There may be limits as to how many peacekeepers are placed in Ukrainian territory. And my sense is that the Trump administration is willing to do those sorts of things to get the deal done.
And would that explain why, for example, America appears, although there are conflicting statements about this, but appears at least to have suggested NATO membership has to be thought to be off the table, is unrealistic for Ukraine, and is saying no American boots on the ground in Ukraine as part of any kind of peacekeeping force? Is that why those things have been put out there already?
Yeah, I think there are different reasons why those items have been put out. I think that is the Trump administration's attempt to signal very strongly to Ukraine they need to come to the table, and for their perspective, that's a way to get a deal done faster.
And what about the Europeans meeting today in Paris, concerned that they're being kept out of these negotiations? Are those concerns justified?
Justified is a tricky word. I'm sure they would like to be included. I think it would be in the best interest of everyone concerned if they were included. My guess is that Trump doesn't think too highly of the Europeans these days and would rather deal with Putin directly.
I suppose we then look at what the Ukrainians are going to be prepared to accept. You say they're probably going to have to accept a lot less than they'd like, but are there going to be red lines that the Ukrainians simply won't accept, or will they just have something imposed on them?
It's very hard to know what their red lines are because, what is said in public isn't necessarily descriptive. I think they would be very unwilling to give up more territory beyond what Russia already controls. I also think they would not be willing to give up significant restrictions on the size of their military after the peace deal is signed, because they recognize they will need to depend on themselves to protect themselves against future Russian aggression.
That was Dan Reiter. He's Professor of Political Sciences at Emory University and author of How Wars End. Well, let's turn now to the approach of the Russian delegation at those talks in Riyadh. Dmitry Trenin is a Russian foreign policy expert, a former military intelligence officer. He's based in Moscow. He's also a member of the Russian International Affairs Council, a diplomatic think tank that's close to Russia's foreign ministry. And I asked him for the perspective of the negotiators from Moscow heading into tomorrow's discussions.
Well, I think that they're approaching it very seriously, but primarily they would want to know how far the United States is willing to go, how serious the United States is with regard to developing a pragmatic relationship with Russia, whether they understand that for Russia, ending the war means so much more than a ceasefire. Russians have been saying countless times that they want the roots of the conflict to be exterminated.
Well, spell out, if you will, Dmitry, what the roots are as far as Russia sees it, because sometimes these things get lost over time.
I think that route number one would be NATO's enlargement. And I would say it's not just a formal expansion of NATO, but the expansion of Ukraine's military ties to the West.
So does that even mean deals that are struck between individual NATO states and Ukraine?
Absolutely, absolutely. For Russians who are mostly focused on the substance rather than the label, there's no difference between, let's say, UK, German forces in Ukraine and Ukraine and NATO.
So what about those deals that have already been struck? I mean, Britain's one of the countries that's already signed a bilateral security deal with Ukraine. Would that have to be reversed?
I think that from the Russian perspective, those deals will have to be cancelled.
Do you think that's realistic? I mean, is that something that you think the West can live with?
I'm more concerned with what Russia can live with.
But what sort of a Ukraine would there be then in this arrangement?
Well, a neutral state, a state that does not see Russia as an adversary, a state that is militarily neutral. Unfortunately, the actions of the European Union have led, I think, the Russians to believe that EU membership would not be a good thing for Ukraine. Russia was prepared to live with that right up until the conflict.
But not now?
No, I can't. I mean, the European Union has earned a very bad name in Russia.
You think that's possibly a red line then? Even if it's not a military alliance, but it's an economic alliance, that's still off the table, you think?
I don't like talking about red lines. I think the whole idea has been discredited in the course of the war. But I'm talking about things that Russia will not permit. I think I must mention that the very fact that the President of the United States is interested not in inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, but in having a deal with Russia. This is a result not of the goodwill of a particular American president, but of the resilience demonstrated by Russia in the 3 years of the war and the successes of the Russian military.
And the realities are that Russia is clearly on the offensive at the moment. It is gaining ground, which makes people wonder, does President Putin really want a deal at this point? What's in it for him?
Well, President Putin wants peace on the terms that Russia would find acceptable. And I think we've discussed some of those terms. And unless and until those terms are within reach, I think Russia will continue to do what it has been doing for the past 3 years.
Where does Europe fit in to these discussions?
Unfortunately, it doesn't. I mean, it has, as I said, that the European Union has earned a bad name. I mean, some of those countries have surprised even me in their vehemence.
Can I ask you about one thing? We're getting ahead of ourselves talking about what a future peace agreement might look like, but I mean, one thing that's already been put out there by the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is the idea of sending British troops to Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force. Is that something that would be acceptable in principle to the Kremlin, do you think?
It's a total non-starter.
Why is that?
Well, because no NATO country is, from the Russian standpoint, is acceptable as a peacekeeper in Ukraine. Just no NATO country. It's NATO boots on the ground. And Russia has been fighting, still continues to fight, to prevent precisely that situation.
Dmitry Trenin, Russian foreign policy expert, speaking to me from Moscow. Well, he says it's a non-starter for the Kremlin, but there have been calls for a vote in the Commons before any deployment of British peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. So let's find out what the public might think of this. Luke Trill is the UK director of the pollsters More in Common, and your organisation, good evening Luke, your organisation has been looking at this, hasn't it?
We have, and good evening. We asked in January, actually, when this idea of Britain potentially sending troops to help be peacekeepers for any deal was being mooted. And what we found was that around half the public, 50%, said that they would support the use of British troops to act as peacekeepers for a peace deal in Ukraine. Only 22% said that they would oppose it, and 28% said neither support or oppose. That's the group that you imagine would want to look at the terms of us sending troops. But as it stands, the public about twice as likely to support sending troops than to oppose.
Much difference across party allegiances?
Well, what's interesting is that supporters of the big two parties, the Tories and Labour, are much more in favour than the average. Around 62% of Conservative voters say they would support it, 64% of Labour voters. But what's interesting is even amongst Reform voters, and we know that the Reform leadership has been more sceptical about Ukraine than the other parties, even amongst Reform voters, they are more likely than not to support sending troops. It's narrower, it's around 43 to 35%, but still more in favour. And I think it's really interesting because what we found throughout the war is that the UK hasn't seen that same degree of polarisation over Ukraine that we've seen, for instance, in the US, where there's a big Democrat-Republican divide, or even actually on the continent between supporters of parties on the right and the left.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's been interesting in focus groups talking to people that British people really do see standing up for Ukraine almost as a sort of existential matter of importance. It's interesting, fairly consistently since the war began, around 70 to 80% of the British public have said it's important to the UK that Ukraine succeeds, that it repels Russia, whatever that might ultimately look like. So I think it's that sense that it matters to us here, and also a sense that we have a duty to Ukrainians. Now, of course, there's also been the fact that there's been cross-party support for Ukraine. In fact, it was a centre-right Prime Minister Boris Johnson who was so robust at the beginning, but actually Keir Starmer has picked up that support as well, and so we just haven't seen those splits. And actually for lots of Britons, our role in Ukraine has become a matter of national pride in a period when we haven't had much to be proud about.
But there is the question of money, isn't there, and defence spending, which is being urged from across the Atlantic to increase. Is there a public appetite for the defence budget to be increased?
Well, there's certainly a public appetite for the government to spend more on defence. So when we asked last year, actually, around 3/4 thought that spending more on defence was important for national security. But, as ever with these public spending questions, there's less willingness for taxes to have to rise to pay for it. In fact, YouGov, fellow pollsters, had a poll actually which showed that around 55% would oppose paying higher taxes for more military spending. Only 30% would support it. So the public perhaps be a little bit cakeist when it comes to defence spending. They want the higher spending, but they don't necessarily want taxes to go up to pay for it.
Luke, many thanks. Luke Trill, UK Director of More in Common, which seems to sum up public attitudes towards Ukraine at least. Thanks for joining us. And coming up later on... In the latest of our Palestinian voices, we'll speak to a Palestinian-Israeli rapper on how art has kept him sane during the war in Gaza. Now, it's one of the government's central policy promises to build 1.5 million new homes in England over the next 5 years. But industry bodies are warning that there is a big obstacle to achieving this, a lack of workers. The Considerate Constructors Scheme, which supports and represents builders, is the latest organisation to say the government's major infrastructure projects are at risk of what it calls a black hole in recruitment. Well, Neil Jefferson is chief executive of the Home Builders Federation. Its members build around 80% of the new homes in England and Wales each year. Good evening.
Good evening, James.
So, as things stand right now, with the number of homes that are being built, are there enough workers?
Yeah, I think at the moment I would say that labour issues are not top of the agenda for UK house builders. There are many other things that we could talk about, and that's mainly because we've actually seen a stagnation in terms of housing supply. In fact, a fall since the end of the previous Conservative government. Previous to that, we'd seen significant growth in housing supply in England and Wales, but it has fallen away. So I think there is some latent capacity. So I think to give an idea, at the moment, we think we're building around about 200,000 new homes a year, compared with the 300,000 a year that will be needed to deliver that 1.5 million across the Parliament in a running state.
Yeah, so that's an increase of 50%, if my maths are right. I mean, that presumably would take more skilled workers. Would they be easy to come by?
I think it's a major challenge. I think it's not just in maybe the trades that we would talk about, such as bricklaying and carpentry, but also we need more planners, we need more managers. The skills are changing. Homes that are being built now will have heat pumps rather than gas boilers, and they'll have photovoltaic panels on the roof for creating electricity. All of this takes new skills. But I think that one of the most positive things I will take from the government's announcement with regards its ambition for building more homes is also an acknowledgement that we need to change the way that we attract and train people if we're going to get anywhere near those numbers. So we've already seen the announcement of Skills England. We've seen some joined up working between the various departments, including Department for Education, Business, Housing, local communities, which is really good to see. And last week we heard announcements on training for apprenticeships, which was welcome news for employers, because it means that apprenticeships can be more dynamic, shorter, and that will meet the needs of employers much better than, frankly, the archaic systems we have at the moment. So there's a lot to do. Things do need to change. Also, I think it's not just a call on government. The house building industry needs to take responsibility itself for training people, and we're seeing significant changes in that area as well. Most notably, a huge investment in a series of hubs, skills hubs built next to existing sites. Sorry, James.
Is there a role, though, for migration? Is that going to be needed?
I think it's something that will be kept under scrutiny. I think that now we have the Migration Advisory Committee, we've got the shortage occupation list, it's kept under constant review. I would suspect that it may be a challenge for certain parts of the country if the growth does come through. London has to be a concern because we've seen a significant fall in housing supply in London, and if that was to pick up, we already rely on a significant percentage of overseas Labour in London, around about 50%. So if London was to pick up, then I think questions will be asked. I think in other parts of the country, I would hope that through the changes that could be made and through that progressive growth that we see, that it won't be needed. But I think that it is something that will need to be kept under constant review.
Neil Jefferson, thanks very much, Chief Executive of the Home Builders Federation there. And in a statement, the government told us it is taking decisive action to fix the housing crisis. This includes tackling years of underinvestment in our skills system and a dire shortage of construction workers. It has announced changes to apprenticeships, which could see an extra 10,000 apprentices qualify each year, including in the construction sector. And they say the revised National Planning Policy Framework published in December 2024 was a key first step in reforming the planning system. Now let's get an update on Pope Francis, because he's being treated for a complex clinical situation and, according to the Vatican, will remain in hospital for as long as necessary. The 88-year-old was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on Friday to undergo treatment and tests for bronchitis. We've been speaking now to Claire Giangrave, who's in Italy and is Vatican correspondent for the Religion News Service. Good evening, Claire.
Good evening.
What is the latest that you are hearing?
Well, the latest development that we heard from the Vatican spokesperson is that the Pope's condition is currently stable and he does not have a fever. But he continues to do this therapy to treat what now doctors believe is a polymicrobial infection of the respiratory tract, which means that various bacteria, fungi, and viruses might be having an impact on the Pope's health.
And he's been suffering from bronchitis, for more than a week now, hasn't he? He couldn't deliver the weekly prayer to pilgrims.
Absolutely.
Has he been seen much?
For us who have been watching him closely for the past 10 days, but I would like to say even longer, he's been looking quite bloated because of the cortisol treatment that he's been doing in the past 10 days, but also he's been struggling to read the speeches and make the various liturgies, perform the various ceremonies that as pontiff he has to oversee, and he's had other people do them in his place. This is a very tiring time for popes, not just because we're out of the Christmas season, which is very labor intensive, but also because...
Can you still hear us, Claire? Oh. I think we've lost the line to Claire. We're going to try. Is she still there? No? No, we've lost the line. Apologies for that. Oh, no, she is back. Claire, you with us?
Oh, yes, I apologize.
Sorry,
for that.
we just lost the line briefly. You were talking about how busy this time of year is for the Pope.
Absolutely. This is the Jubilee year where pilgrims from all over the world are coming to Rome and they expect to see the Pope, and it's been very tiring for an 88-year-old pontiff, one of the oldest in the Church's history.
We understand, though, he has been able to do some work to make phone calls, for example.
Yes, the Vatican spokesman today told us that not only does he continue his routine of calling the Catholic Holy Family Parish in Gaza, but he has also been reading, and importantly, today the Pope appointed the first woman, Sister Raffaella Petrini, to head the Gobernatorat of the Vatican. It's essentially as if the Vatican had a female prime minister. This is a lot about a Pope who might be sick physically, but has a clear mind of what his legacy and his pontificate will be beyond him.
Claire, thank you very much for that update. Claire Giangrave, Vatican correspondent for the Religion News Service. Israel's Defence Minister has announced the formation today of a special agency for the voluntary departure of Gazans. It is the latest sign that Israel is embracing Donald Trump's proposal for relocating the population of the Gaza Strip so that the United States can take over the territory and rebuild it. Arab leaders are rather more sceptical about that idea. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, ahead of his meetings with Sergei Lavrov, has been holding meetings today in Saudi Arabia with senior figures in the kingdom, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to discuss alternative Arab plans for the territory. Meanwhile, here on The World Tonight, we have been speaking to Palestinians from different walks of life about how they see their future. Tonight, we are going to hear from Tamer Nafai, a member of the Palestinian hip-hop collective DAM. He and his fellow band members are among the nearly 2 million Palestinians who live in Israel and have Israeli passports. They do have relatives in Gaza, though, so what impact has the war there had on his art?
music is my therapy. It sounds a bit like a cliche. If there wasn't for art during this insane period of time, we are witnessing horrors that we are supposed to read in history as we live. So music was my therapy, and my therapist was my therapy as well. I had to use both.
But what did you find yourself writing about? Did you find yourself writing about things that were far removed from war and politics?
It's that juggling part. Writing is my profession, so I'm signed to contracts where I have deadlines to deliver. So it's not just about being in the mood to write or not. You need to sit your ass down and just work, like any other person, even if you don't like the job, okay? It's hard to disconnect. It's hard to ignore the elephant in the room. It's hard to ignore more than 50,000 people massacred in Gaza. So I would say that yes, there was a lot of articles that I wrote, but to remember that I'm a human being and I'm an artist, I also did all kind of songs that were about love. But I didn't release them, though, because it's not the time.
Has it been difficult? Have you felt that even if you do want to write about the situation in Gaza or write anything political, is it more difficult in today's Israel?
First of all, yes, and it's not a monster under the bed. It's a fact. We have more than 30 Palestinians living in Israel being arrested for just a naive, innocent post. But I've noticed that the press is still free in a way. So I believe in that Bruce Lee saying, "Be water, my friend." So what I felt is, since I have a lot to say, I just, instead of posting things on media, I just wrote it and used the press as articles, as I said. This is what made me go more into the press side.
Do you see any improvements coming? Do you think if this ceasefire lasts, things could improve?
I don't know. I know that my writing is improving. That's what I control, brother.
But is it improving because of the situation? Is it having a positive impact?
Look, we cannot just pass on and wish for a better life. Something that needs to be done. You cannot have a bully doing whatever they want, and not maybe, we can. I said the word massacre at the beginning. Maybe some people will raise their brow. You know what? I don't want to use that word. What I'm saying is, it needs to be investigated. I think a better future is if we look bravely in the eyes of the present, and we just go and we investigate everything. The 7th of October, whatever is happening in Gaza, and if everyone is innocent, everyone's innocent. If everyone it needs to be charged, they need to be charged. How would I feel happy if I know that someone had the ability, no matter which side now, had the ability to go kill, drop bombs, and then nobody confronts him, and that's it.
Is there anything that art can do positively, though, in this situation, do you think?
I think that what I can do is document the emotions that we are having right now. That's my job. In one of the songs, in one of the lines, I say that art and music, it's not a pilot. It's not Captain Sully. It's not gonna stop the crash. But it's like a black box. It's there to document what is happening. And this is art. Again, to change the world. For me, to change the world, you need a country, you need an army, you need economy, you need bondings with other countries. This is what changed the world. This is what decides if Gaza, for example, if Gazan people are going to stay in their houses or not. It's part of the decisions. So I can't say my song or any other song will beat these forces. I'm not disrespecting any artist. I'm fully aware of my contribution to the world, and it's art, and I'm going to focus on it. What it does, sometimes it's like a lottery. I don't know. But for me, does it change? It won't change. It won't change the fact that this is my talent, this is my skill, and I'm going to keep improving in that.
The reflections of Tamar Nafa, who's a hip-hop artist and a Palestinian citizen of Israel. A quick look now at tomorrow's front pages of the newspapers, and unsurprisingly, Ukraine dominates. The Daily Telegraph front page says, Germany rejects the Prime Minister's Ukraine peace plan. The Times leads with Ukraine needs US safety pledges, PM to tell Trump. That's at the meeting that Keir Starmer will attend with President Trump in America next week. And the newspaper says, Britain braced for more cuts to boost defence spending over Ukraine crisis, something we touched on earlier there with Luke Trill. Now we're going to turn our mind to the climate crisis and ask this question: could wolves be part of the solution to it. A research by a team of scientists from the University of Leeds suggests that reintroducing wolves to the Scottish Highlands, re-wolfing perhaps, would reduce the red deer population there and in turn lead to an expansion of woodland, which is a natural carbon store. Professor Dominic Spracklin is the lead author of the report, and he spoke to the BBC.
We're facing major crises in biodiversity and climate change. I think we need to start to think more broadly and think about trying to restore healthy ecosystems, restore some of the lost species back into those ecosystems could help us address some of those really large challenges. In Europe, wolves have started to recolonise large parts of their former range. They're now in Germany, they're now in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is, really densely populated with humans, and wolves are living there quite close to humans within, densely populated areas, showing that coexistence is possible. There are challenges across Europe with livestock farmers, but in some areas, farmers are learning how to live with wolves back in the landscape, and there's some inspiring stories about farmers finding old methods, I guess, of how they did that in the past and using them again.
Professor Dominic Spracklin. Well, let's hear from the farming community. Martin Kennedy is former president of the National Farmers Union Scotland. He was part of a team that visited Norway to examine the impact of reintroducing wolves there, and he's on the line. Good evening, Martin.
Good evening, James.
So, what's your view? You went and saw at first hand what the experience was in Norway. What did it lead you to think about reintroducing wolves in Scotland?
Extremely concerned, James. I mean, there was a team of us went out in 2017 specifically to speak to Norwegian farmers and the impact they had with predation. It was right across the board. It was actually lynx we were looking at, but it was lynx, it was wolverine, it was wolves, it was bears, and the reintroduction of these species decimated a lot of the farming communities, particularly on the high altitude areas, like, similar to some areas we have in Scotland, the less favoured areas where we have a lot of livestock. And over the period of 10 years, there was 1,000 farmers that had actually given up. And so we've got to remember that it's not all, we have to be careful about woodland and creating more woodland. Climate change is a big issue right across the globe. We need to be able to control the fuel load that we actually have in our ground now. So grazing livestock, producing nutrient-dense protein, and actually creating an environment that's conducive to great biodiversity is something we're really proud of in Scotland. So we're very, very careful we don't compromise our ability to produce that protein well.
Understood, but the professor there was suggesting that farmers in other parts of Europe have been able to coexist with predators. Is that something that could happen in Scotland?
Yeah, well, really interesting, James, because I've been with part of the NFU Scotland job as president for the past 4 years. I've been in COPA in Brussels meetings, every couple of months over the past 4 years. And when you're speaking to farmers out there, I can assure you that's not where they are. They're having massive problems just now with large carnivores, and it's having a big impact on not only people's livelihoods, but and the ability to keep landscapes in a state that's not going to be conducive to wildfires. We've just seen in 2023 the biggest wildfire that the UK has seen on Cannock Estate in the Suburbs, 30 square miles, where there's been no burning, no livestock grazing, and that's the impact of that was fuel load. This just passed in October. There was a world meeting of specialists across the world from the fire service that was looking at specifically on fuel load and for wildfires across Scotland. We need to keep.
Sure. What about the problem that the professor there is suggesting that the wolves can solve, which is that of the red deer eating the tree saplings?
Yeah, I think that's incredible, really. So, we can control. We should be able to control the deer without having wolves to control the deer. The issue we have with deer at the minute. Deer venison is a very high quality lean meat, lean protein meat, and is very dense, nutrient dense protein, which we should be using. We do not value that anymore, and the problem is if we were to focus more on our diets, we would value venison. And the beauty of having good venison that we can actually control, and this wild animals we're actually trying to control the deer populations, which we do have to do, but we need to use that venison and use that as part of our diet as well. And being realistic, when you go back 40, 50 years ago, when there were a bit of a nuisance, some would say, with a lot of poachers on the land, and they controlled numbers to a degree, but that's not happening now. People are so used to having food that's very cheap, very affordable, and affordable fine, but cheap's not.
Right, so you're not saying more poachers, you're saying eat more venison?
No, I'm not saying what's absolutely not. I'm just saying what did happen up to then. But we did manage the deer population. But we need to do this we have to think about this. You know, when wolves were here 400 years ago, there was only 1 million people in Scotland, if that in total. We've got a world population now that is growing at a huge rate of knots. We're over 8 billion now, and we need to have the ability to produce food, which we can do in Scotland very, very well. And we have a thing in Scotland called rain, which a lot of parts of the world do not have. We think it's a nuisance sometimes. Very often as farmers we think we really curse the rain, but actually it's one of the biggest assets we have, and our ability to use that and manage our landscapes with cattle, with sheep, without the worry of predation is really concerning. So we can do it well.
In praise of rain and venison, Martin Kennedy, former president of the National Farmers Union Scotland, thanks very much. Our closing headline tonight: Sir Keir Starmer has said any Ukraine peace deal would require a US backstop to deter Russia from attacking its neighbour again. Speaking after a hastily convened meeting with other European leaders in Paris, the Prime Minister repeated that he would consider deploying UK troops to Ukraine in the event of a lasting peace agreement. The US and Russia will discuss ending the Ukraine conflict when they hold high-level talks in Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Sir Keir Starmer will meet Donald Trump next week in Washington. And that is The World Tonight. This is James Kamarasamy. I'm back tomorrow at 10, but for now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night.
Studio direction was by Holly Palmer. The editor was Matthew Symington. This is BBC Radio 4.
I have this lifelong relationship with the countryside. I wouldn't swap that for anything.
6 guests sharing their love of nature with me, Martha Carney.
When I put a snorkel on, or lucky enough to go scuba diving, and I enter the sea there's nowhere I'd rather be. It's endlessly fascinating.
Discovering the favourite places of Adjoa Ando, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall and Sir James Dyson.
We've got now 1.4 million strawberry plants, so we obviously have humans to pick them, but we're also experimenting with robots.
The new series of This Natural Life starts on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds on Thursday afternoon at 3.
Now on Radio 4, the book at bedtime is Tracy Chevalier's new novel, A Love Letter to Venice and the Artisans of Murano. Emily Bruni reads The Glassmaker.
A brief explanation of time alla Veneziana. The city of water runs by its own clock. Venice and its neighbouring islands have always felt frozen in time, and perhaps they are. One of Venice's glittering treasures has for centuries been the glass on its attendant island Murano. Glass is a peculiar substance. The sand is manufactured from, magically turning translucent or even transparent when melted. Like the island where it is produced, it abides by its own natural laws. How would you know if the artisans of the city of water and the island of glass seem to be aging more slowly than the world beyond? It is 1486, the height of the Renaissance, and Venice is revelling in its position as the trade centre of Europe and much of the rest of the world. Ursula Rosso is 9 years old. She lives on Murano, but has not yet worked with glass. Ursula and her mother and brothers were walking beside the Rio de Vitrai, the canal of the glassmakers. The canal wasn't as deep as Ursula thought. When she fell in, the water's coldness jolted her and she flailed about. Her brother Marco was laughing as Ursula came up spluttering, the water only to her shoulders. "You pushed me," she cried. "Cretino." Giacomo, always the kinder brother, pulled Ursula up. She fell onto the fondamenta, gasping and spitting, mortified. Laura Rosso helped her daughter to her feet. "Cold you are, and dirty." She nodded at a door close by. "You should go into the Baroviers and warm up by their furnace. They won't let a girl catch her death, even a rival's daughter." She glanced through the door's iron filigree window, then pulled it open. "Quiet now. Keep your eyes open and report back what you see." The Baroviers were the stars of the glass world. They would not want intruders coming in to see what they were up to. But Ursula's mother was not someone you argued with, and so she opened the door and slid in. The workshop was full of men pulling punties, long iron rods, in and out of the furnace with molten globes of glass on the ends. Boys known as garzoni fed the fire. Then Ursula spied a woman, slightly to one side, hands on hips. This was Maria Barovier, sister of Maestro Giovanni, a rare woman glassmaker who let fools feel her keen tongue. She was known as Marietta, but Ursula thought the diminutive did not suit such a formidable woman. She was frowning at a thick glass cane held out to her by one of the garzoni. No, the red should be more prominent, otherwise the bead will be swamped by the white and blue. Her voice was deep and annoyed. Where's the mold? As the garzone looked away fearfully from his employer, his eyes fell on Ursula. Maria Barovier followed his gaze. Out, Rosso, she barked. Spia. Ursula fled, scrabbling at the door in her haste. Back on the Fondamenta dei Vetrai, her family had disappeared. They would be waiting at home, her mother expecting a full report. In the kitchen, Marco was sitting at the long table where the family took their meals, while Laura Rosso chopped onions and Maddalena, their servant, fried sardines. Laura glanced up. You didn't last long? What were they making? Goblets, I think. Maria Barovier was there, Ursula continued. She was talking to a garzone, scolding him about cane. Cane, eh? What colour was it? A red, white and blue. It was for a bead. She mentioned a mould. Beads? And moulded, too. Her mother looked thoughtful. I must tell your father. A month later, the Baroviers introduced to the world the Rosetta, a barrel-shaped bead made of layers of red, white and blue, beveled so that 12 points of white stars emerged through the blue. They were like nothing anyone on Murano had made before. The Rosso workshop employed garzonetti to keep the furnace fed and the floors swept. If they stayed on for 5 years, they became garzoni, serving a 6-year apprenticeship to learn from Ursula's father, Lorenzo, and Paolo. Bald, silent Paolo was Lorenzo's servente, his main assistant, just below Maestro, and handled glass skillfully. Giacomo was steady, like his father, intently studying each process. Marco, the older son, was different. He would get excited about a new technique or design, but if he couldn't master it, he grew frustrated, breaking pieces unnecessarily and storming out. Marco did make one exceptionally beautiful piece, an ornate goblet with handles shaped like Venetian winged lions and a shallow bowl. One day, when no one was around, Ursula tried to fill it with water, but the bowl held scarcely any liquid, and the moment she moved it, what little water there was spilled down her dress. By the time Ursula was 17, she looked much like her mother, with dark hair and eyes, arched eyebrows, and an air of impatience, as if waiting for something to happen. Something did happen. One day she paused in the doorway of the workshop to watch the men at work. Her father was at the maestro's bench. His servente and garzoni were working on the long filigreed arm of a pitcher. Paolo pulled it from the furnace and brought the hot orange tube to Lorenzo, who nodded. Perfetto, was his last word. A garzone lifted it with a forked rod, but he swung it a little too casually, and the curved glass arm fell onto the bench and shattered, sending shards of glass all over the workshop, one even landing at Ursula's feet. The one with Lorenzo Rosso as its target flew like a hot dart straight into his neck. A bright gush of red sprayed across the floor, and he toppled from the bench. Running to the kitchen, Ursula grabbed her mother's arm. Padre! Accident! Laura Rosso hurried to the workshop, Ursula following, and knelt in the pool of blood next to her husband, using her skirt to try to stem the flow. Che Dio abbia pietà della sua anima e della nostra, she said, and crossed herself. All the Murano glassmakers came to Lorenzo Rosso's funeral, and even the Venetian merchant Gottfried Klinkenberg, with whom he had done most of his business. Maria Barovier was among the hundreds. She looked at Ursula, a long, cool gaze, dispassionate, but not unfriendly. Several weeks later, Ursula was crossing Campo San Donato, leaving the Basilica, when she passed Maria sitting on a bench. Been praying for your father, Ursula Rosso? Ursula nodded, fighting tears. No one deserved what happened to him. Maria looked her up and down. You've grown. Almost a woman. You need a new dress. This was true. Ursula flushed, nodded low to Maria, and hurried away. A week later, a boy brought to the door a package of folded fabric. Fine linen, brown, but with something in it of red. No note. Quality. Laura Rosso smoothed the fabric. Ursula cleared her throat. It's for me. It's from Maria Barovier. She expected her mother to take the fabric and throw it back in Maria's face. But Laura looked her daughter up and down and said, I'll make it tomorrow. You'll wear it when you go to see her and ask for her help. We're in trouble, and I need Marietta Barovier to tell us what to do. A few weeks before, Laura Rosso and Marco had taken a traghetto, one of the regular gondolas ferrying passengers between Murano and Venice, over to see Gottfried Klinkenberg. On their return, Ursula's mother had said little except that they'd promised to fill the latest order already placed for goblets and bowls. And they had, with Paolo quietly working to fix as many of Marco's mistakes as he could. But Klinkenberg had not ordered more. Ask Marietta Barovier what to do, Laura repeated now. Ursula nodded. There is another thing to contend with, her mother added. It will soon become obvious to all. She pulled her dress against her belly, and Ursula started. Tell Marietta about the baby, Laura said, though no one else. It may soften her a bit. The second time Ursula went inside the Barovier workshop, she was now a young woman in a crisp new dress. The young man who answered the door was the same one who had been scolded by Maria Barovier. He was no longer a half-grown garzone, but had the strong arms of a servente. His eyes were so black you couldn't see the pupils. See? Maria Barovier came out from the furnace, waving the assistant away. Stefano, go back and keep an eye on the blue. She folded her arms. What do you need? Ursula explained as clearly as she could. Maria listened carefully, only raising her eyebrows when she heard that Laura Rosso was pregnant. Klinkenberg knows his glass. I'll talk to him, find out what the flaws are. Come back in 3 days. Their meeting was clearly over. At the door, Maria looked Ursula up and down and gave a small nod, her only indication that she noted and approved of the new dress. 3 days later, Stefano opened the workshop door to Ursula. The goblets don't match, Maria Barovier announced. The bowls don't lie steady and there are bubbles in them. Out of respect for your father, Klinkenberg took the work, but he's had to sell them at a loss. He won't make that sentimental mistake again. What do we do? Said Ursula. Marco and Giacomo must work out what they can make well rather than follow your father. But they must work it out quickly before they lose Klinkenberg's goodwill. It was sensible advice, but it was what anyone might have told them. Another thing. Beads that you can make. Me? My brother will never allow it. A girl in the workshop? Ursula blushed, for of course the Baroviers had done just that. Maria chuckled. Make them in the kitchen over a lamp, not the workshop. If you're skilled enough, Marco will understand the value. I have a cousin who could teach you. Go to Elena Barovier tomorrow evening behind San Pietro Martire and ask her to show you how. Grazie, Signora Maria, she said. I will take your advice. Take this then. A gift to keep you going. Maria reached in her pocket, pulled out a red, white and blue rosetta and handed it to Ursula. I always wanted a daughter, she grunted, to slice through all the men.
The Glassmaker continues tomorrow as Ursula takes the first steps on her creative journey. Tracy Chevalier's novel was read by Emily Bruni and abridged by Sian Priest. The producer is Aileen McCready, and it's a BBC Audio Scotland production for Radio 4.